I haven't quite figured out how to do it.
Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCN Global with a latest edition of our Social Change Career Podcast live stream, season 13. I think we're on episode 7. And today we're going to be talking about leading with purpose with Parminder Vir on careers that drive global impact. For people who have not joined us before, the podcast generally goes about 1 hour. We love to hear from people watching live, so feel free, particularly on LinkedIn, to share where you're watching from, and again, your questions and comments throughout. And that's great. 3 quick requests. Please follow Parminder on LinkedIn. Please, if you like the podcast, consider rating and or sharing it. So that's the number one thing you can do for anybody who has a podcast. Take 30 seconds to share or rate. And again, we have about 160 episodes you can find on PCN Global or any podcasting platform. And I think that's everything. So I will summarize Parminder's bio, which is very long and impressive. So I will not do it all. And then we will jump right in. So she is a commercially focused executive with broad international experience in entrepreneurship, business development, and media. In her career spanning 4 decades, she has dedicated her life to telling untold stories, particularly those of underserved communities, and resourcing the skills and imagination of these communities. In 2002, she was awarded an OBE for services to the broadcasting and film industry. I think she's the second person on our podcast with that title. Sana Mandrolini was on our podcast, I think, pre getting the award, but thank you so much. Currently, she is writing a work memoir, kind of connecting her 4 decades of experience in media, impact, and entrepreneurship. She was previously the CEO of the Tony Elumelu Foundation. I'm sure I mispronounced that, apologies. And she helped develop and build a comprehensive entrepreneurship program that has impacted over 10,000 African entrepreneurs across the continent from 2014 to 2021. She continues to advocate for entrepreneurship as the best path for the continent's social and economic development, and also does a lot of work on media and narrative change. She leads her strategic insights as an advisory board member of Mama Moni Limited and Help Mum, contributes as a narrative advisor at Mustard Venture Agency, and is director at Zecora Media and Arts Cultural Heritage Initiative. She's also had a very significant career at the BBC, media production, her own media company, Formation Films, and worked in arts administration at the beginning of her career with the Greater London Council. So that is a short summary of a very impressive career. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. In full transparency, her daughter used to live here and now is in Bogota, and we used to work out of a space where she worked, Impact Hub Medellin, which is one of the most beautiful impact hubs in the world. Parminder is in London, and thank you so much for joining us. And just to start off with, if you think back to your teenage years, thank you. If you think back to your teenage years, when did you have have you always been interested in media and culture, or how did you discover? I mean, one, you've had a very varied career path, but how in the world did you at least figure out the beginning of your career path?
Wow, thank you so much, Craig, and it's really, really fantastic to see you again. You'd kindly invited me to do this before, so I'm really, and it's just really, really grateful and really enjoy speaking with you and going down these paths. So, I mean, my parents were immigrants to Britain, and I was born in a tiny village in Punjab, North India. And I guess the future, if I had stayed in India, was 18 years old, marriage, children, and a life in a rural Punjab. But in 1963, when I was I think I must have been about 7, when my father migrated on a voucher scheme to Britain. And that was the first major transformation of my life's journey, as it were. And we joined him in 2 years later in 1965. I was 9 years old. And I guess being a child of a first generation immigrant in Britain, from working class background, there was no ambitions. I think The only ambition I had was that my grandfather and my father were teachers, and I aspired to be a teacher. And in fact, I trained as a teacher in physical education and geography and movement studies, but I never taught. I did 4 years, 3 years as teacher's training, and 1 year in Bachelor of Education. Um, the idea of working in the arts, making films, going on to work in Africa around entrepreneurship was never in my universe at that time. Um, but I would say that it was my father's decision to educate his children. I remember him saying, I cannot, he had 4 daughters and 1 son, and he said, and he was a postal worker, I can't give you dowry, which is the expected thing in an Indian marriage, but I can give you education. And that education is your passport to success. Yeah. So I think I took that basic education that I got as a teenager, and then into doing teachers training, and into I really took that as an opportunity. I guess I seized the opportunity, and as I begin to now reflect on my 40-year career, I realize I've done two things. One is either create career opportunities or seize the opportunities, and we'll talk about that through the course of this discussion.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Rahul and Thomas, and everyone. Please let us know where you're watching from, your questions and comments. And so I really like I mean, your father sounds like and your parents like an incredible human being to talk about, you know, focusing on education as a gift to help his four daughters find their path to, both life and employment and beyond that. And how did you go from university to the London Arts Council, or how did, if you studied to be an educator, how did you? I mean, you talked about also movement studies, but how did you switch from? And I'll have to say, my mom, she's
I
80.
know.
My mom is 81 now, and it's she was a teacher for a few years, and she did not like it. And then back, at her age, of course you could do something different, but it's like you either became a secretary. I mean, I'm talking about mainstream society in the U.S., a secretary or a teacher. I mean, of course you could do other things. She went off on a much different path. So she tried teaching, and just it wasn't for her. So how did you go from training on this to finding, something that maybe
Yeah,
wasn't
no.
as viable, or at least something that you could imagine?
Well, I mean, it was very interesting because as part of my, teacher's training, I had to do a dissertation, and I chose to do it on Indian classical dance. And there were in 1978, there was very little information on Indian classical dance in the UK. But I heard someone on the radio station, a woman called Naseem Khan, who had written a book called The Arts Britain Ignores. And I wrote to her saying, could she recommend, given that she was really, she had started to map the arts of the ethnic minorities. So I used to always say that I didn't arrive in Britain with an empty suitcase. My parents didn't come with an empty suitcase. They came with a language, a culture, values, ways of living and being that they brought with them. And they took the best that they brought with them and the best that they found when they found themselves in Britain. This lady, Naseem Khan, very kindly wrote back saying, yes, and here are some suggestions. Why don't you come and meet me in London when you finish your studies? Which I did. That resulted in a 6-month contract because I was planning to go on to America to study radiography because I trained as a physical education teacher, and radiotherapy and radiography was very much part of the sports in the kind of sports arena. I said, well, I'm around for 6 months. Anyway, doing that 6 months is what changed my entire life. I traveled around the UK, or the southern part of the UK, mapping what was called the ethnic minority arts. And that's ethnic minorities, people from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and other countries who had come to Britain and settled in Britain. But their arts were seen as folk, as cultural, but not as art forms, yeah? I.e., that these were things that they were doing in order to educate themselves or stay connected with their culture back home. And that was, I knew nothing about funding and the kind of the funding ecosystem, but just doing that research for 6 months gave me an understanding not just of the ethnic minority arts, but also the ecosystem, the funding supporting ecosystem for the arts in general. And what I discovered was a disconnect and a gap between what those communities and the artists from those communities were developing, were practicing, and the funding bodies, which were largely, British, English, and there was a massive disconnect. So I almost started a journey of becoming that bridge, that connector between the two. And once, it was like, oh my God, I think this is my mission, this is my passion, that I can do more than just a 6 month research. So I abandoned the idea of going to America to continue my training in, further training in pursuing my first passion for sports, and switched to, I don't know whether it was arts or it was enabling, facilitating, supporting the development and the growth of ethnic minority arts in the UK. And I found and spent the first 10 years of my life doing that, the first 10 years of my career. So I went from mapping to then programming, because I ended up at the Commonwealth Institute in London. I had access to a theatre, galleries, and so I was able to put on, I did a Black Film Festival, bringing Black American films from America and Black British films here, put on dance, drama in the theatre, promoted big exhibition on African art, artists like Aubrey Williams from Guyana, had a major exhibition during my time at the Commonwealth Institute. So, and then it was the Greater London Council, 1981 to 86. It was a really transformative period, and suddenly I could now I had my own fund, and then we had a thing called the Ethnic Arts Fund. I had money to be able to now to give as grants to all the artists that I had met over those 3 or 4 years leading up to the GLC.
An amazing example of how taking a little bit of a risk to reach out to somebody who was doing interesting work, the author of The Art Britain Ignores, and her response led to this completely different career path. And that's obviously one of the things is, I'm not a career
Yeah,
planner, but like you never know. I mean, I've been living in Colombia for 7 years. I never thought I'd be here. Like it's hard to know where you're going to wind up, but often taking that risk to learn from others can be
yeah.
incredibly beneficial. And I want to ask a sports question. What is your, as we were talking before we started, my son's a very competitive soccer player. So what is your preferred sports? And do you
Yeah.
have any favorite teams?
Oh, no, I mean, personally, I started off by playing badminton and
Mhm.
hockey and representing my school, college, and also my county. So but I think what I learned in sports, which has seen me through to this age, is teamwork, competitiveness. You don't go on the hockey pitch to lose; you go on to win and to do your best but camaraderie. So for me, hockey, and then I embraced lacrosse as a sport when I was doing my teacher's training. Athletics, particularly long, cross country running. I guess now, I mean, sports is in my DNA. I watch the Olympics. I will watch the tennis. I love, no matter where I am in the world, to watch. I mean, to watch sports with the people. For example, in Lagos, when I lived in Lagos, it was like, there would be a pin drop silence when Manchester United were playing someone else, and I'd say, but you guys, you live in Lagos, why are you supporting Premier League in the UK? But also when, thankfully the African football Premier League has also emerged, but to watch countries come together and to play and to engage. And then as a business person, I began to see obviously sports as a phenomenal income generator
Mhm.
for everybody in the country, yeah, and everywhere in the world.
Yes, we watch a lot of football. In the US, they call it soccer, but football. We were in Argentina. Um, Colombia just hosted the under 20 Women's World Cup, and the
Yeah.
games were in three different cities. We went to most of the games in Medellin to watch to
Wow.
watch the Colombia versus Mexico. And Colombia has this amazing
That's
young
a
players
tough
like
one.
and we won. And Colombia has this amazing female players like a Pele Linda Caicedo. To see her in person, with 45, it was the largest turnout Colombia's ever had for a women's soccer game until they had the game in Bogota. But I think it was like 36,000. And just it's mind blowing to see that. Um,
But
so,
isn't it amazing that in our lifetime how soccer or football has changed, huh?
yeah,
I mean, in growing up, yes, women played football and we played lacrosse and other games, but they were never seen as warranting, you know, certainly broadcast time or people's time and attention. But it's so, so powerful to see women in every sport, women's team being recognized and given that that place of importance. Yeah.
yeah. It's still in
So,
Colombia.
young girls can grow up.
It's still under resourced women's soccer, in terms of compared to the men's soccer. But it is interesting if people don't know Alexis Ohanian, the husband of Serena Williams, one of the world's top tennis players. He's a big
Yeah.
investor in the LA, if I'm blanking the name, but the Los Angeles women's football team. He's an investor along with a whole bunch of amazing professional female athletes and
Yeah.
actresses, and they're getting record turnouts. So it is like women's sports. All sports can be amazing, but women's sports is the idea. And in Medi, I'd say there is professional women's soccer, but a lot of girls play until 12 or 13, then they drop out. So there still needs to be like this
Yeah.
change of like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's anyway. So going back to the arts and funding, just a question is, for people who are thinking about securing funding, since you've been on many different roles, but let's just focus on arts. And we have artists in our community. I did my dissertation arts and peace building in Bosnia. But if someone's like an artist and they want to seek support for their work, whether it's a commercial project, a film, theater piece, or just visual arts, as someone who's helped to provide resources, what are some of your thoughts around when a funder is receiving a pitch? Like what do you want to see as a funder when you're allocating
I
resources?
know.
And what makes a difference where obviously usually you're part of a team, you can't just say yes, but like what makes like a proposal really stand out, and what are the ones that maybe aren't as strong?
I think when I was working in the arts and also when I moved, pivoted into being a film producer, I think life was easier. There weren't the reams of application forms online. There weren't the big kind of committees. Um, but I think, but I mean, I guess there are some things that remain universal. I guess, the key thing is is ideas. People are investing in ideas. Yeah. So what's your idea and how is it different? From all the other similar ideas that I guess any committee or anybody making a decision on funding a creative project. I guess the other, and it's the same, is really who's behind it. Yeah. So they're investing in the idea and the team or the individual, the creative behind that idea as well. Yeah. And I guess in when I was doing this in way back in the 80s, it was also the social cultural impact as well. Is this a community-based project? How is the community going to benefit? How they're going to be engaged in the execution, the production, the consumption, the distribution of whatever it is, theater, music, dance, film. So I guess it's and I don't think those fundamental pillars have changed. Yeah. Um, uh, they've just got more and more complicated or sophisticated or more and more competitive, I guess. But certainly those pillars or those foundational questions remain. I really, if I was now pitching an idea for a theater or for say I'm setting up a dance company or I'm setting up a theater company, I think the important thing is that whatever you're doing is that you research and you understand the ecosystem, right? That you really research the organizations and individuals that you're going to be pitching your idea to, so that there's an alignment between your vision and their mission, or their vision and your mission. Um, and then now you have no excuse not to do your research, because you can do it sitting in front of you can do it with the press of a button. Then one had to read newspapers and, I mean, find information about the organizations that you were applying for funding. But in my case, but certainly in terms of that period, was also changing the mindset of the funders. Yeah. Funders, had a perception that, the ethnic minority communities were only here temporarily and they were going to leave, and they really didn't have to do a lot of engagement. And anyway, they would eventually become assimilated and absorb into sort of white European cultures. Yeah. That gradually their own cultural expressions would dissipate, but that did not happen. So I think for me, it's also important. And I think that question continues, not around changing the mindset of the funders. I know that when I moved into film and television production, and particularly into film finance, I know the amount of work we had to do to change the mindset of investors, that we were trying to woo to invest in the creative industry, to invest in film production, which is very, very risky. And there, we were also having to show them what would be the returns on their investment. But I guess that's the same is the case for if you're in the creative sector, whatever creative sector you're in across the spectrum, there's always the returns on someone else's money, someone else's investment. I
So,
think
so
I think the
good.
other thing, Craig, is really important for artists and creatives to not to forget. Yes, you can pursue your creative passions, but it's also really important to constantly make an input into policy and regulation for your particular sector.
So a question there. Back when I was doing my dissertation, again, I looked at arts in Bosnia, both in resisting the war and post-war in terms of reconciliation, so theater, film, dance, and a little bit visual arts. And one of the things I tried to find is and this wasn't specific to Bosnia, but to find research that shows if money is invested in the arts, what would be the potential economic return. And I'm curious I think the more a society, both government and foundations and educators invest in art, it's almost, and particularly where it's not determined propagandist art, where it has to be like this format. But I often think that's a strong sign of resiliency and creativity and better societal relations. And from the economic
Oh,
perspective,
yeah.
either as a let's say a government agency, a foundation, or an investor, what like if you're thinking there's the moral argument, we should have art. But like, what if you're approaching a policymaker and investor, what type of data or arguments do you make why investing in the arts is worthwhile?
Oh, wow. I mean, now it is data led. It is much, much more. Um, I mean, all the moral, but there is the business case, right? It's like for a long time we made the moral case for diversity. And I remember in 2000, I began to make a business case for diversity. It's the same in terms of investing in the arts and culture in this broader sense. I look at, the transformation of the media and entertainment industry in India and its contribution to the GDP. It's like the third largest contribution, right? Similarly, in the UK, the contribution of the media and the creative industry is phenomenal in both within in terms of our GDP, but also its reach and its impact outside of Britain, America, Europe, the world. Yeah. So I think, we have to, assemble that narrative of the value of the creative sector and the creative industry. And I would say that over the last, certainly the decade, 2 decades, I began to see a shift in the language we used for making a case for why we should continue supporting the arts. I absolutely fundamentally agree that government should have what I call subsidy. That it should be there to subsidize the arts and cultural institutions. That I can go to the National Art Gallery, the museums, the theaters, because they have been underpinned and supported by government funding. Not every country in the world that I've traveled to has that privilege. You go to Nigeria, where the creative sector, whether it's film, television, fashion, music, has been very much from the ground up and is very much developed and driven by the artists themselves, right? The government does not have an infrastructure or a framework or the funding to invest in that. And yet, the reach and the impact of the Nigerian creative talent and creative industries is massive. It's worldwide. I'm not sure in Colombia. It probably has a slightly more and a better. The government does have a system for supporting national and local artists, yeah, but not every country. Particularly across the African continent has that. Yeah. So I think there has been a shift, and now more and more, even in Europe, US, and the UK, there is the shift to making a business case, and we have the statistics, we have the information that we can use, as well as obviously, imagine a society where there are no artists.
Mhm.
Imagine a world with no artists. Huh?
It would be a pretty sad society. For
Exactly.
people watching now, or this will be in the show notes. I put Parminder's website, so you can look at some of both her scope of her work and some of her films, produced, directed. Um, and if people don't know your work, and do you have like I don't want to ask you to pick your favorite child, but do you have either one of your favorite films that you've helped produce and one maybe you've directed that you would say, you know, that you think have a broad audience that you might encourage people to look at, and are any available on streaming channels or YouTube, or you have to purchase them? Like, where could people find
No.
them?
So it's very interesting we're doing this webinar today, because just on for the whole of October 11th to the October to the 1st of November, two young curators came together and curated a selection of my films that were produced by me and directed, as well as by my partner Julian Henriquez. And so for the last 4 weeks, once every Friday evening from 5:30 to 9, we've been showing. They showed the films, and then we had audience discussion. which was very nice. And it was like time travel. I was going back sometime in some films. The last film we showed, it was 1984. So it was like a 40-year-old film, which in fact I had funded while I was working as the ethnic arts officer in the GLC. The very first film that we showed in this program on the 11th of October was our feature film Baby Mother, a reggae musical, which was set in northwest London, not very far from where I am sitting right now. And it really is a kind of window into the Jamaican dancehall scene. And that film was made in 1997 and released in 1998. The whole process of going from idea of the film to the screen took 5 years. So watching the film, I was reflecting back on those 5 years of development, and it wasn't the raising of the money; it was the importance of getting the script right on paper before you are given the green light, and then raising £2 million. I don't know how much that is in dollars, to actually make the film. And it was an all black reggae musical, so commissioning lots of new songs, and the songs were sung on, and it was all on location as well. So I would say that is one of my favorite and one of the most challenging, the one of the most passionate film projects of mine. I think my other would be a film I made about Algerian women who fought in the Algerian Revolution. And again, it started with me watching Battle of Algiers in 1982. And then 1992, I found myself in Algeria meeting those women and their daughters and their granddaughters, um, as a way of paying tribute to the extraordinary resilience and commitment of the mothers, the grandmothers, of Algeria, and a pivotal role that they played. We showed that to the audience, who is like, 30 years younger, and how they were moved, and their questions around, so what's happening in Algeria now, what's happened to those women, i.e., that it still has resonance, it still has value. Um, a film that I am in the process of now supporting mentoring a young filmmaker who's Nigerian American, journalist, who'd been shooting a lot of footage of the impact of the Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. And it's extraordinarily powerful footage, testimonies of particularly women and girls who were caught in the crossfire of that movement. And we are not we have been trying to raise money in order to complete that film, to do the post production. Was that your
Wonderful.
question? Did I
Yes,
answer
yes,
your
yes.
question?
I guess just one follow-up question, then we'll move on. If people want to stream, are they available for rent or streaming on,
Oh, yeah, no,
Amazon?
sorry, yeah, yeah. So this film retrospective, as I called it, which really galvanized me or catalyzed me into saying, "Gosh, Paminda, you really should assemble all your films in one space and find and really unravel the rights. Who owns the rights?" And so I've begun that process, and the films where I and my company still the rights were given to me, and they're usually non-theatrical or non-broadcast rights, yeah, which are educational, which are for, you know, yeah, educational viewing. I'm going to now put them together and make a lot like the Algerian film. I really want to make them available on the open source. You have to remember, when I was making these films, there was no digital, there was no, the platforms, there was no email, even, there was no, mobile, etc., etc. And but now, at least, it's possible to assemble those films in one platform. And where I don't have the rights, because they're shared rights, at least one can direct whoever may be interested, with a link to where they can either rent the film, like Baby Mother. I think you can still rent it from Amazon or from the British Film Institute.
Good one. So a question for aspiring filmmakers. Um, any tips? We'll get into entrepreneurship, but any tips? Because
No, no,
I, I
no.
I have a friend here who's a filmmaker. He's a very his name is Michael Zimbalis. He's done a lot of documentaries and good movies. You might know him, and did one of the favorite movies that we have, Pele, The Birth of a Legend, which another friend's cousin produced. But if someone's thinking about like film is such a
Oh,
powerful
yes, yes,
medium,
yes.
like
Yeah.
any suggestions? Is it better to just find a job at anything in a TV or film production, film school? Like how did you develop your skills? And then like for people, let's say this current generation who are really thinking about they would like to work in you know TV or film, any I mean, it's changing so fast, but any general tips for how to move in that area?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think there's two things. I think there's one is if you want to work in the industry, and the film, as we know, is a very broad value chain. So there's one is if you want to work in the industry. The other is if you want to make your own, you want to tell stories. Yeah. I think if I was starting out and I said I wanted to work in the film industry, I do what I did myself. I think my first was I created an opportunity. I created an opportunity. I was the BBC. Again, this was in 1986. The BBC wanted to prove or show that it was employing and engaging diverse talent, yeah, but they didn't know where this talent was or if it even existed. So I assembled a show reel for them of black filmmaking in Britain, and little pieces from the black filmmakers. And I said, here is the talent, and here is the films that they've made. Now you can employ them. You can, bring them into the institution, or you can engage them as writers, directors, or whatever. I mean, that was me putting my foot in the toe of me. I mean, I so wanted to move from the arts into film and television. And I was offered a 6-month research contract in the BBC's Music and Arts Department. And in a sense, that's all you need is 6 months, because you immerse yourself inside this institution, as I did. And one of the most important, valuable skills that I left within those 6 months was how to research and write a story. Yeah, because stories hit you from every direction. But how do you find the story in a lot of the material? So researching and writing the story was a really important skill. And then telling that story using the visual, the audio, and text, etc. Yeah, or i.e., assembling and telling those stories in a 3-minute segment, 5-minute segment, i.e., that there's no. I mean, for me, I did not go to film school. I did not train as a filmmaker. I learned making films on the job. But I realized that I didn't want to be an institutional filmmaker. I wanted to be an independent filmmaker. And in 1986, 87, I left and set up our own production company, Formation Films. But in today's generation, I would say that, you must, if you want to work in the sector, you must know your sector inside out. There is no excuse for not researching. If you want to, the first question, if you were coming to me and saying, I want to make films, I want to produce television, is like, what's the things that you've been watching? What excites you? What do you think is wrong? What do you think is missing in television? Or what do you think and it's the same for film. So building a, I don't know, your black book of ideas of films and stories that you want to tell. But I also think it's really important for you to know, why is it you want to work in this industry? Is it because you think it's glamorous? There's a lot of money. All of those things are wrong. It's not glamorous. There isn't a lot of money. There's 24/7. You have to work. There's no work-life balance, and there's no security in this industry, right? So know that, but then also within the industry, know which bit of this sector, or this, yeah, segment you want to work in. Is it the creative? Is it the management side? Is it the technical side? Is it the post-production side? Because all of those, thankfully, in film and television, they're still quite specialists, skills. So I want, an editor hardly ever aspires to be a director because they love editing, right? A cinematographer really loves to shoot. A sound recordist loves to get the best sound for your film. A set designer, a costume designer, etc., etc. I could go on, right? As well as your line producer and your production manager. So I think what I learned in those 6 months was like, wow, okay, now where in this do I want to be? And what I knew where I didn't want to be was that I didn't want to direct. I wanted to produce, because as a producer, you're assembling the whole of that together, and you're taking that to potential commissioning editors, for backing your idea. Now it's I don't know, the streaming platforms, the broadcasters, the soft funding that's available to possibly private investors. I mean, all I can say to you is, in the 30, 40 years that I've been making films, I'm constantly you're constantly trying to stay one step ahead of where the industry is going. I remember once someone came to our office and said in 2000 that people will be watching content on this. I remember looking at him and I said, "Are you mad? We've spent millions of pounds in producing this drama, and people are going to be watching it." 20 years later, I myself watch that content. Yeah. So I think, in summary, decide, do you want to work in the industry? In which case you have to immerse yourself in how the industry is structured, and then find within that, um, entry points into that. Yeah. If you want to be an independent creative, it's your ideas and ideas and ideas, which still means you've got to be aware of what's being produced, what's being commissioned, and where your idea, can fit into that. Yeah.
It's fun. My son is 13. For a school project, they wrote a script, and now they're doing a short animated movie. And maybe like 4 minutes. So I watched the closer to final version yesterday, and he's gotten frustrated, but just to see the joy he's doing with another friend of like creating the backgrounds and the script, and he also had the frustration. Everything just not everything, but everything got messed up one day. Which is always part of the process. So when I moved to entrepreneurship, and so
Yeah.
how in the world did you go from working in the creative industries in UK, but also globally, to landing in Nigeria, to becoming the head of the Tony Elumelu Foundation, and I think you were the first CEO. So like, and then really focus.
I was the second team.
The podcast we did this morning was with a friend from Uganda. So a lot of what we talked about is kind of opportunity and jobs in Africa. And so, and part of your fundamental belief is that, entrepreneurship is not the answer, but it can play an important role. So just how did you make that transition? And, what did it mean to help set up this organization that's still going very strong today, supporting thousands of entrepreneurs?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that is, I mean, I use words like it was a destiny call, it was preparation meets opportunity. all that I had done in arts, all that I had done in bringing stories to the screen in film and television production. And then I'd moved into sort of business development, seeing the emergence of the emerging market. Now you can see, the power of the global south. Before it was a third world, and then it was emerging markets. Um, so it was like, I mean, I was fully aware, even, throughout those decades, I never called myself an entrepreneur, but I was aware that the media and the creative sector was driven by entrepreneurs. We were in the UK, we were called the independent sector. Effectively, we were running little businesses from our front bedrooms, from our lofts, right? I.e., we were running businesses, yeah? Albeit we were making films rather than providing services or widgets. Um, how did I end up? I had done a lot of work in across the African continent, first as a filmmaker, so I was aware of the African continent. I had also begun, and I had begun to engage with the African continent, particularly the Nigerian media and creative industries, and looked at how they could learn and I guess formalize themselves and professionalize their sector in Nigeria, taking a cue from how India had achieved it and how it could contribute, and even more so to the Nigerian economy and to the African economy. And I had gone on I was doing a feasibility study for, ironically, an insurance company who had wanted to create a media, a film and television studio, build and, purpose built media and a film and television studio in another part of Nigeria. But then they looked at the costs and said, no, this is beyond us. That had given me an opportunity to understand the advertising sector, the film sector, the television sector, the radio, the entire production sector, right? The post production sector. I knew, like, my gosh, this Nigeria is really an important country in the context of the 54 African countries. And one of the people I had met was the first CEO of the Tony Elumelu Foundation. And but I realized, no, the foundation then, this wasn't a right meeting to take. But somehow the Tony Elumelu Foundation stayed in my mind. And I sent an email out of the blue to Tony Elumelu saying, I heard, I've read your Afri-Capitalism paper. I like your focus on African entrepreneurship. This is what I've done in the past. I'd love to find a way of bringing that experience to the foundation in a board advisory capacity. And I know you're coming to London and I would love to meet you. So it was an email sent sort of midnight, and to which I got a response immediately the following day saying, yes, Mr. Elumelu would love to meet you, and he's going to be in London on such a date. I think I wrote him on the 1st of April. I met him on the 11th of April. And on the 24th of April, I was sitting at my desk in Lagos designing the African Entrepreneurship Program in April 2014. So I guess the point I'm making to everyone out there is that I was offering myself as it was, I guess, even then, and I was 58 years old, I hadn't lost my sense of curiosity. I hadn't lost my sense of service. I hadn't lost my sense of giving back. I hadn't lost my sense of taking risks. And that and I was prepared. I had all the tools and the skills, the experience, so that when they said, well, actually, what we'd like you to do is to come and work in the foundation, as initially it was as a director of the entrepreneurship program, I said, oh my God, okay, so I'll move to Lagos. And they said yes. And that was those decisions. If I had thought about it over weeks, I think I might have not gone. But within 24 hours of receiving the proposal, and I said yes, I will come. I said, you know what, I can give it 6 months to 9 months. I will live there. I will design the program, and then let them implement it. I never imagined that I would stay. I would continue then to implement what I designed for over 5 years. Yeah.
So thinking about entrepreneurship, I mean, two questions. So one is youth unemployment in many countries is quite large. Colombia, there's a term in Spanish called NIMI, neither in formal education or employment. In Colombia it's high, but in parts of sub-Saharan Africa it's crazy. So just a little bit like, what do you see of the role of entrepreneurship, and how much is the responsibility of governments or multilaterals, just in terms of creating decent, good
Yeah,
jobs
yeah.
and economic opportunity?
You know, across the 5 years was, an amazing transformation of myself, of the foundation, of Mr. Elumelu, the founder, and of the entire continent, the SME sector. To the extent that I know wherever you are in the world, it's the SMEs that drive the economic development of every economy in the world. It's not a it's not a label. It's a reality. Yeah. The only difference is that I think in the West, particularly UK, Europe, and the US, there is a much greater enabling environment to support the emergence of those entrepreneurs, yeah, and the SMEs. But the reality is that there is a large sector, and yes, it's called the informal sector, but it is a very entrepreneurial sector. And the program that I designed was to institutionalize luck and democratize opportunities, to give even that informal sector who had business ideas and they'd been generating some level of revenues for themselves, to be able to now take it to the next level and the next level. And what we were going to do was to provide them with mentoring, with seed capital, a small seed capital, and with a 12-week training program, really in terms of capacity building. I was blown, and then access to being connected to other like minded entrepreneurs across the African continent. So, the African continent, for me, yes, we do have an African trade agreement, but it's actually the entrepreneurs that connect the African continent in that real Pan African way. Yeah. Not in as Pan Africanism as a political ideology, but entrepreneurs, are the ones that do trade with each other, that do learn from each other, that do bring about solutions that work in one country, be it Ghana, that can be transported to Botswana, and Botswana can be transported to Egypt. Yeah, it really does connect the entire Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone, and the Arab-speaking nations across that amazing, beautiful continent. I would say that I would say, that what I discovered was that it wasn't enough just for us to run this program, provide $5,000 seed capital, have a commitment of doing that for 10,000 entrepreneurs, and investing Tony Elumelu's $100 million that he had committed. That at the end of it, it would still be a drop in the ocean. That what we also had to do was to advocate for change in policy and regulation. We had to take the value and the importance of entrepreneurship to the government and the government leaders across the African countries, many of whom did not see entrepreneurship as a viable, investable opportunity. But also, more fundamentally, we also had to change the attitudes and the perceptions of the donor agencies that you talk about, of how they saw Africa, that it was a continent waiting with a begging bowl. No. That Africa needed aid. No. What Africa needs is trade and trading opportunities. Yeah. What Africa needs is investment in across those sectors. Yeah. And so gradually, and that, that the development tool that these agencies could adopt was entrepreneurship development, was actually the investment in entrepreneurs and SMEs, yeah, but in a much more structured way rather than, little bits of, just a haphazard way of doing it. And for many of them, because we had a proof of concept, the Tony Elumelu Foundation Entrepreneurship Program became a kind of a framework, a model that they could get hold of. They could see that we had done it the first year. We had, we were now implementing the lessons that we were learning. And they started to come on board by the second year. Organizations like I don't know, the ICRC, UNDP, GIZ, all of them were coming to the foundation saying, so how can we engage? How can we support? How can we be partners in this, in this movement to change the African continent through investment and support of the African entrepreneurs, yeah, and and the governments also began to look at ways that they could change their policies, because we gave them evidence-based research and said, what, the African entrepreneurs, really what they want the government to do is to build an enabling environment, nothing else, right? They're not asking you to give the entrepreneurs grants or anything, but just the internet, the roadways, the logistics, the taxation, um, capacity building, right? There are very big things that each government across the 54 African countries can do to really enable their entrepreneurs to succeed with their amazing business ideas.
So we can go on forever. We're going to start wrapping up, even though. Um, so
Okay.
a couple of things. When people come to you, and obviously you've had multiple careers and probably more to come, and very strong skill sets. But if someone,
Oh my
if a
God.
if a younger person or any age comes to you and says, "What is your overall advice for building a career of impact?" How much is just the internal drive versus the upskilling through formal education versus just go out and find a problem and not to save the world, but gain experience, or like any general advice you have for change makers, whether they want to be in entrepreneurship or policy or arts of, these are the things you suggest are critical or at least important to look at. Um,
It's very, if I was, okay, I would not advise you to do what my own career trajectory, which is know nothing about arts administration, learn it on the job, know nothing about film and television production, but learn it on the job and but do it really well. Know nothing about business development, learn by doing it. Certainly know nothing about structuring programs for entrepreneurs and then doing it on that scale as I did in Africa, 54 countries. But I did it by doing it on the job. So my career path has been about doing. I'm a doer, I guess, and learning and pivoting and learning and refining. Um, but I would say that it is important to get on along if you decide that you don't, that you're not going to go through the formal education system of, go and do a course in film school or go and do a degree in film production or in arts administration or in entrepreneurship development, um, I would say, it's really, really fundamental to upskill, to continue to add to your skills bank. Yeah. That it's not, it's, yeah. I mean, I would, and maybe I did stop and do some short programs, but I think my career path and my learning has been unusual. But I would say that in all of this, I've really stayed true to my values. I think it's really important to know who you are. I think it's important. You can only change the world if you know who you are. Yeah. Otherwise, it's I don't know. It's social work. I think it's really important um, to know who you are and to know your passion and purpose. Yeah. Or in the opportunities, I could have said, "Oh my God, working in the arts is incredibly, but boring." But what I did, because I wasn't an artist then myself, I wasn't a filmmaker. I had a passion for the arts, but it's really, I guess, what I did was to turn that opportunity that into a mission, and the mission became to empower and support the development and growth of Black and ethnic minority creativity in the UK. In the same way, I knew nothing about designing an entrepreneurship program, but the mission of seeing entrepreneurship as a way of for the economic transformation of the continent became my mission. And entrepreneurship was how I was going to be able to impact. Yeah. So I think it's really is finding your passion and purpose and making whatever it is that you're doing, um, your mission to succeed.
So there's three more questions, and I think they're all relatively short.
Oh my
The
God.
first, no, they're short. The first is in terms of your current path. Are you currently working on upskilling in any particular areas and places you might encourage other change makers to say, again, there's no guarantees, but if you want to find opportunities and be competitive, it might be useful to develop skills in this area.
So I mean, for me personally, I really had to discipline myself and say, no, you're not going to go looking for another big, challenging job. The big challenge you're going to address, which you've been avoiding for a long, long time, is to look at these three big transformational career paths that you've had. What are the lessons that you've learned from it? What are the stories that you can tell? And to, either to write it or to digitize all that I've got. I have found I had boxes full of archives from my first 10-year career in the arts. So I've digitized a lot of my the policy papers, a lot of the Black Arts and ethnic arts initiatives, a lot of transformational work which has laid in boxes. So to bring that, and make it available to the next generation, and want to do similarly in the film, that each film has its own challenges from going from an idea to the screen. I think I want to write the story of the African entrepreneurship, my journey, my 10 years of work, and which continues. Um, I think and so what I'm doing, and I started writing it, and then I realized, oh my God, you know what? I need a writing coach. I've never been on a writer's program or retreat. For the first time, I took myself on a 4-day writer's retreat, um, and then I said, you know what, I actually, I want to find a writer's coach, who will just read what I write and give me just very objective, critical feedback. So I have now at this age in my life, and I'm 69, found a writer's coach who is, and so that also gives me a framework. So I will write sections and share it with her. Yeah. So I think in my case, I've had continuous learning and skills development from arts into film, into business development, into entrepreneurship. I would say adopt that absolutely. You can't stand still and stay still. I think in today's age, I started my life in the analog age and have embraced the digital. I think I would love to be even more digitally fluent, but I would say that digital fluency amongst you guys is really, really important. I think what has really sustained and enabled me is my capacity to network and build strong networks in those different sectors. So, networking strategically and investing time in that is really, really, really important. I was also going to say that particularly if you, and we are talking to a lot of people in the global south, I think do not forget you have such a rich multicultural perspective that you can bring to any situation, and really to bring the whole of you. When I talk to African entrepreneurs and they're going to pitch in some event in Norway or Sweden, I say, but don't forget you are an African. Don't forget what you know they won't know about the African continent. Take that with you. And that is like your market knowledge. You have a unique access and understanding of that market knowledge, right? Um, I think the other is, I guess, I mean, it's very interesting that my daughter has become fluent in Spanish as a result of living now for 14 years nearly in Colombia. And I really see the importance of a language like Spanish, French, but also languages, in the context of Africa, the hundreds of your own local languages, yeah, and developing those language skills. I think it's also important that if you can find ways of I don't know, I guess, getting international exposure with whatever skills you have. I mean, for me, the international exposure, as soon as I finished my first decade of work in terms of the UK Black and ethnic minority arts, I really I wanted to move out of the UK and take the skills into the world. And for me, film provided the most amazing medium through which to do that. But you must never stop learning new skills, upskilling yourself, and pivoting constantly. That's what entrepreneurs do all the time. Yes, we take risks, and yes, we fail, but failure for me is only a failure if we haven't actually learned the lessons from that failure in order to apply it to the next pivot or the next, iteration of your life's journey.
Wow,
Sorry, that
amazing.
was
Oh,
long.
no, that was amazing wisdom. You could put it like on a t-shirt or a poster. No, I'm being serious, and I think, and there's a lot of, I've switched careers multiple times. There's a lot of moments of terror, so I think the idea of, but there's also a lot of moments of excitement, and the I find when I get burnt out in a sector, it's important to start learning, and that might be a sign it's time to do something different, at least keep expanding the skills. And I mean, I will never know anything in any one sector. That's impossible. But but at a certain point, it feels like, okay, this is the same
Yeah.
conversation, the same system. And so the last two questions, one is, what is just the best way for people to follow your work? And if somebody wanted to reach out, is it LinkedIn? Go to your website, or any preferred channel? Do you have a newsletter?
No, I mean, gosh, I'm not as organized. I am now beginning to consolidate. It's the one thing is to be out there in the world, and now I'm now looking inward. So eventually this year I started at the beginning in January, February, started building my website, which had languished for a long, long time. So you can at least there is I've attempted to narrativize this journey from arts into entrepreneurship. So you can find a lot of information. I do, and there's a lot of, I do write, I used to, I mean, I post on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn and reach out to me on LinkedIn. But on the website, you can also send me a message through my website as well. My vision for the website is that it's an information sharing platform. So as I write the stories of, how did I make Baby Mother and what did I learn from the making of it, I'll be posting it on the website. Similarly, around entrepreneurship and also in terms of all the work that I did in the arts and culture. So website eventually, the idea is to grow it as an open source platform for information. I mean, it would be, I need to find in a more organized way like this, like you have enabled me to do, to share my knowledge and experience. But hopefully it will emerge, whether it's through a podcast or doing sort of regular webinars on themes. Yeah. Um, but really, in this world of platforms, in this time of platforms, if you really want to find someone, you can find them.
And your
And
website is really,
I
really
will
good.
try.
Um,
Oh, thank you.
yes, and happy to
Thank
talk
you.
podcast.
It took a
So,
long.
so the last question, just is there any favorite TV series, movies, or books that are occupying your brain in a good way? Doesn't need to have anything to do with like work, but just something like is like you've seen it or watched it or read it, and it's like something you might say others might want to check out.
It's very interesting as I'm reading. It's quite a very different. I'm reading. Oh gosh, that's a good. And because I'm writing, I'm also reading quite a lot of books on how to write, and I'm discovering, the power of the words and the use of the words. So quite a lot of how to write books. And in fact, one of the things I'm doing is producing a monthly digest of what I'm watching, what I'm reading, what I'm listening to, and what I am seeing on theatre and exhibitions. So I'll certainly be sharing the links to that in my next digest. I'm also very interested in, not now, but have always been in the whole kind of the spiritual development, my own spiritual development, not, and so I'm reading really interesting books, particularly, I guess, inspired by my time that I'm spending in the mountains in India. Um, Watching, I mean, I'm a member of BAFTA, which is the equivalent of the British Film Academy, and so I have to watch like 300 films a year, and so now there's an intense period of watching those films. And I just finished watching a film called Horde. I watched a film about these young, the nice thing about the being a BAFTA member is you've got a diverse choice of, you've got foreign language films, you've got small independent films, you've got big studio movies, and you're watching them all at the same time. So film, for me, watching films, listening to podcasts. Um, for me, one of the regular podcasts that I mean, it's not a podcast, it's a digital news channel, is called Vantage, comes out of India. I love the presenter, Palki Sharma, and I love their take on an Indian perspective on the world news. and I'm very, very, very passionate about what's happening with the BRICS and the expansion of BRICS and the importance of the global South organizing itself. I'm very passionate about, what I saw and how India took the G20 and re-energized it and put Africa, the African Union, as a part of the G20. I don't know why it had never made, been given that permanent membership. So I'm interested in, where does, for me, and the reason I'm interested in all of that is I want to see where do the African entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship sit in this new scramble for Africa, and particularly, both in terms of policies, but also in terms of the African entrepreneurs being part of that value chain of trade agreements between the global South and the wider world.
Wonderful. So we'll wrap up just two quick comments. So one is my brother-in-law has been involved in documentary film forever, and taught and is one of the Colombia's leading film archivists. And he had a
Oh,
2 year period where he was
wow.
on the Colombian film rating agency. So it's funny, he would complain he had to watch movies like, twice a week. And I mean, it's a pretty good job to sit around and then Catalina, my wife, and I would do small scale angel investing in social impact startups, and around the world, just very small through syndicates. But some of the stuff we've invested out of Africa is mind blowing. And I think the things that are not just copying what has been done elsewhere, but are either
Yeah.
adopting or innovating. And there's one out of
Mm.
um, Kenya and Rwanda called Basigo, and it's we have an electric car, and they are using bead technology, but they've adapted to the African
Yeah.
market, and so they have electric buses, and I think they Rwanda, Kenya, they're expanding, but the idea is like pollution in a lot of
Yeah.
African cities is horrible, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
both
Yeah.
helping. Anyway, there's like so much exciting stuff in entrepreneurship going on, in particular Kenya, Nigeria, and some South
Yeah.
Africa, but across the continent, and the idea
Across
is
the continent. Yeah.
it's not just importing another model. It's like what is
No.
either
No. No. No.
reach.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
um, but
I
I
mean,
think we should. But,
I mean, next week on the 9th, I'm going to be going to South Africa for the Africa Tech Summit.
mm,
And there, as part of the Africa Tech Summit, I think is Africa Com, we're organizing a ministerial summit of all the ICT ministers from the continent to begin to develop a coherent, so that there is a coherent ICT strategy for the development, for the technological development of the continent. Yeah. And you're absolutely, those are the sectors where technology is where Africa has leapfrogged, and the new innovations will come from there.
okay, well, I want to thank you so much
Yeah.
for generously sharing your time and
Thank
wisdom and
you.
energy. And again, for as we started off, for people, please follow Parminder on LinkedIn. She shares a lot of interesting content and news. Her website is a wonderful resource, so please look, share. Stay tuned for more on the digital film that will archive. Please check out PCDN, and if you like the podcast, it takes 30 seconds, rate or share it. And we also have newsletters and all that other stuff. And this episode, so we interviewed Victor Ochin this morning, so that'll be out this coming Friday. Then Parminder's will be a audio podcast the following Friday. I guess whatever. Thank you
Fantastic.
so much, and hope to see you in
Great.
Colombia.
Thank
And
you, Craig.
okay,
Thank you.
thank
Thank
you,
you so much.
thank you, everyone.